Hello, everybody. My name is Richard Matthew. I'm a professor of urban planning and public policy at the University of California, Irvine, where I also direct the Blum Center for Poverty Alleviation. Welcome today to our event on environment, peace, and conflict, opportunities and risks for the new administration. And I want to first begin by welcoming everybody who's been able to join us today. I know we all talk about Zoom fatigue. Everybody's experiencing Zoom fatigue, but I think there's still something exciting about being able to have an event attended by people across the country from around the world. There's something exciting about that. And we've taken a look at who's registered, and literally it is people from all over the world, as well as all over the United States. So welcome. I also want to thank the Environmental Peace Building Association and the Wilson Center for co-sponsoring today's event. And I want to begin with a couple of quick comments to set the context, and then introduce our remarkable panel. You know, a couple of years ago, I had the honor of introducing Stephen Smith to a large group of people in California, a NASA astronaut. And we got to talk a little bit before the event, and he was telling me about what astronauts call they call it the orbital perspective, or the overview effect. And what they're referring to is that moment from outer space when they look down at the planet. They said it is really quite an overwhelming sight when you see the planet from outer space. Steve Smith went on 4 space voyages covering some 60 million miles, and he's particularly well known for having done an enormous amount of walking in space, something like 7 spacewalks, 50 hours that he spent hanging out there in space looking down at the planet. And he said to me that he thought that if we could take the 200 plus leaders of the world and put them in outer space and give them that perspective, they would look down and they would see a planet that is not only beautiful, but that looks very fragile and that looks like a shared space. And he said, if you could see it from that perspective, you would want to collaborate. You would want to work together to protect it. You would want to work together to allow the flourishing of humankind, but in a way that made sense from an ecological perspective. He said, now, unfortunately, we'll never get to test this theory because we're not going to be able to put 200 world leaders in outer space. World leaders have to build their big picture from the ground level. And they have to navigate the complex world, the complex global challenges that we're experiencing today, the urgent environmental challenges from that vantage point. And that's got to be a hard task when you're looking at everything from ground level. Fortunately, world leaders are in a great position to seek advice, to put together the big picture by talking to and listening to people with lots of experience, lots of expertise, different perspectives. They're not in this alone. And the objective today really is to bring together a group of people who have the sort of experience, the sort of expertise that really does serve as a platform for valuable insight and what I would call wisdom. And so I can't imagine a better group of people to talk about some of the urgent challenges from an environmental perspective that the new administration is going to face, some of the ways it might think about its priorities and what it should and shouldn't be doing. I want to, when you have a panel like this, no introduction, especially if you're trying to be brief, can do justice to everybody. But let me talk a little bit about each person in order. Say a few words, and then I will ask some questions. You in the audience, we invite you to put your own questions and comments into the Q&A. And in about 45 minutes, we'll turn to those and ask the panelists to comment on your questions and so on. But please use the Q&A so we can sort through them and share them with our panelists. Let me begin then with a set of introductions. And I'd like to start with Dr. Tegan Blaine. She is the Senior Advisor of Environment and Conflict at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She has degrees from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and Brown University. She has a fascinating background. She served as a Peace Corps volunteer and as an expert on climate change and international development at McKinsey & Company, the State Department, USAID, and most recently, National Geographic Society before taking on her most recent post. So we're delighted, Tegan, to have you join us. Cynthia Brady is currently a global fellow at the Wilson Center. She has degrees from Tufts University and Denison University. She has worked on climate change and environmental security issues with a wide range of organizations, including the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the United Nations, the State Department, the Office of Global Change, and most recently, she spent more than a decade leading a variety of initiatives for USAID. Sherry Goodman is a senior fellow at the Wilson Center currently. She's a graduate of Amherst and Harvard, and she also has a truly remarkable career, beginning with working as a practicing lawyer. But she's also served as a staff member of the Senate Armed Forces Committee. And this is where I first came into contact with her. She was the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security under the Clinton administration. When all of this really moved to the top of the global agenda, and when the US announced to the world its intention to lead on the set of issues that we're going to be talking about today. She later served as Senior Vice President and General Counsel for the Center for Naval Analysis. Lieutenant General Chip Gregson received degrees from the US Naval Academy and the Naval War College. He then spent 35 years as a Marine, a much decorated Marine, serving in a wide range of capacities. I've had the wonderful pleasure of getting to know him over the past few years in Southern California. His career as a Marine ultimately culminated with him serving as commander of US Marine Forces Pacific. He subsequently worked as the Chief Operating Officer for the US Olympic Committee before serving as the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Asian and Pacific Security Affairs under the Obama administration. And finally, Dr. Aaron Salzberg, who is currently director of the Water Institute and a distinguished professor of environmental sciences and engineering at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He has degrees from the University of Maryland and MIT. He previously worked and had a very long and distinguished career in the Department of State, where his many accomplishments include leading the development of the first US government-wide global water strategy. I want to thank all of our panelists for agreeing to join us today. It's really exciting for me I think I've met all of you except for Tegan in the past. And it's wonderful to see you all today. So what I want to do is begin with a question. I'm going to ask, I'm going to begin, I think, by asking Dr. Blaine to lead us off. You know, in the past, there's been a series of reports from the World Bank, the groundswell reports, for example, the 2020 Ecological Threat Register, and what we know about the IPCC's 6th assessment report that's going to be made public later this year, that suggests that many parts of the world, especially in that sort of heavy populated area between the tropics, many parts of the world are experiencing continuing increases in temperature, humidity, sea level rise, sort of, saltwater intrusion into groundwater, which run the risk of making large areas more or less impossible to live in. And so one of the things people are concerned about today is the prospect of desperate people moving to find more reliable access to water and food and cooler temperatures. According to some estimates, as many as 70% of all species on the planet are already moving in their search for water, food, and cooler temperatures. Obviously, we can't project into the future with zero uncertainty. There's always some things that could change a little bit, but given what we're hearing, what conflicts from your perspective should we be worried about that could arise in the foreseeable future? And maybe what should we be doing right away? What should this current administration be doing right away to get on top of this?
That's such an important question. And I'm really excited to be beginning with that, because I think that that's something that we absolutely have to start taking on. I think that there's a lot of research that shows that the majority of movement is likely to be within a particular region instead of moving from region to other regions. But as climate change in particular becomes stronger and stronger, I expect that we will see changes in what kind of migration is happening or what people are interested in doing. Right now, one of the things that I think we really ought to be thinking about is people moving from a fragile environment to another fragile environment. In West Africa, for example, people are going to be moving out of the Sahel. And as they move out of the Sahel, they're going to be landing in coastal areas where you have a lot of large cities that are vulnerable to other kinds of threats. And so, how do we deal with those issues? And also, how do we actually understand what makes people move? Oftentimes, they won't say it's due to climate change, it's due to, immediate or these kind of big picture things. They'll say it's due to looking for other economic opportunities, looking for more security for their family, looking for better incomes. And yet oftentimes there is an environmental element to all of that as well. And so we do need to begin better understanding the motivations that lead people to move. But then we also need to be looking not just where they're coming from, but where they're moving to. And what does that mean for the stability of those locations? What does that mean for the fragility of those locations? And how do we help them move in a way that doesn't create greater political instability in areas where you're already dealing with environmental threats, where you're dealing with weak governance systems and communities that don't necessarily have the resources to plan for the future, much less planning for the future with influxes of people. But I think it's also really important to start thinking about how we deal with people moving in ways that are humane and that are ethical and respect the communities that they're coming from and their who they are as people and what makes their lives meaningful. And so we need to start talking not just about what kinds of movements of people we might see, but how we actually make those movements humane and recognize the humanity of each individual who is being forced to move for one reason or another. So there are a lot of technical issues that probably need to be dealt with to better understand why people will move, what's actually driving their decisions, and what that means about the locations that they're moving to and how we manage those movements. But we also need to remember that we have individuals who are moving and think about what it means from an ethical standpoint to support those kinds of those humans who are moving and make sure that we're respecting their communities, that we're respecting their culture, and that we're giving them pathways that actually seem realistic and human to them when they have to make those kinds of choices. I'll be very curious what other people say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a thank you so much. That's a great response to get us started, and we can all, I'm sure, think of areas where we have a project in Bangladesh where the combination of refugees coming in from Myanmar and saltwater intrusion along the southern coast is making it a very volatile, difficult situation. I'm sure other people have ideas, and let me just open it up to other panelists who might want to weigh in on this particular issue. And please just feel comfortable raising your hand and let me acknowledge you or something. Anyone?
I'm happy to jump in.
Yes, great.
Build on the what Tegan discussed. I struck by your comment about people are going in this climate era. People are moving from one fragile location to another. And how do you understand the underlying environmental and climate conditions that are both driving that migration, and what can you do? What can we do practically to enable people to retain their livelihoods where they are, or to, if it's necessary, to in a humane way find opportunities for relocation. As we know, we live in an era of the greatest global migration since World War II, much of it driven by climate change, built on top of an era where we're having billion-dollar climate disasters now on a regular basis all around the world. We talk about what's happening in the US, Texas, of course, but it's happening all around the world. I think because of my prior experience serving in the Department of Defense at the end of the Cold War, where we used environmental security cooperation as a way to advance the broader foreign policy and national security objectives of that era. I'm going to come back. I think about sort of using this broader environmental and climate security cooperation in sort of its next chapter. So in the 90s, we used sort of an interagency, integrated whole of government environmental security cooperation to advance democracy. We didn't call it peace building, but at the time, but it was really trust and, at least in the Defense Department, civilian control of the military, which was a high priority both in the former Warsaw Pact countries and parts of the Western Hemisphere and other places at the time. But when the broader national security set of agencies, including the Defense Department, set out to do environmental security cooperation, which we did with every combatant commander. I led these cooperations, and there still are the tentacles of those programs out there in the agencies to be lifted up again now in this era. It was really an interagency type of effort that drew upon the strengths of the diplomatic and the development community, and now I'd say the disaster response and disaster risk reduction communities as well, to bring a whole integrated set of skills and capabilities together. And I see that kind of environmental security, climate, peace building, environmental peace building opportunity inherent in where we need as a forefront of foreign policy in this era. And that's got to be built into the strategies that have been called for in the executive orders of President Biden from January 27th, as well as the one that following week that had a whole section on climate migration. And that's very much at a forefront of in some ways, climate and security cooperation 2.0. In a way that recognizes the importance of the peace building humanitarian. It's as opposed to militaries being in the lead, it's really the militaries are in support as kind of backup, providing almost their technical and support assistance capabilities to the development, disaster risk reduction, peace building, and sort of integrated whole of government, whole of society efforts.
Sherry, fantastic. And you sort of set up a great opportunity, I think, to move the conversation forward. I want to turn to General Gregson and build on what we've just heard a little bit and ask you, there seems to be, and there's lots of evidence suggesting that the sort of most severe impacts of climate change are often taking places in areas that are fragile from other perspectives as well, like the Arctic, like the South China Seas, like parts of the Middle East, Gaza, and so on, where there are already ongoing conflicts, military operations, and so on. So you this sort of tremendously interlocking set of crises where we've got a history of conflict, you have military activity, now you have droughts and heat waves and concerns about water scarcity. What considerations will the new administration have to make as it develops policy for these geopolitically tense and fragile regions?
Well, thanks for the invitation to write President Biden's to-do list here. I was taken with both Tegan's comments and Sherry's comments. Heard a little echo of the Peace Corps ethos and what Tegan was talking about, and I'm a huge fan of the Peace Corps, having seen what they can do. Characterizing these population movements, this can be a very, very dangerous thing because you have embedded in these population movements truly evil leadership. autocratic leaders that make the problems worse in their own country, et cetera, et cetera. It's interesting that during the 1980s, the height of the Cold War, the Naval War College used to run a series of summer games, and it was kind of the thing you had to show up to if you were going to be somebody from the State Department or the Defense Department. And every year, one of the problems that was chosen was a collapse of central government authority in Mexico. And every year, all the best minds that they'd gather at these games failed to find a solution to that. Collapse of central government authority, massive amounts of people moving north from Mexico and Central America. What do you do? Obviously, there's no military solution to it, but it sure looked like there was no other solution for it either. I was privileged to serve in Somalia at the beginning of that engagement, and people that are going to die anyway from starvation or lack of water or something are going to move. And they're desperate people, and that can create dangerous conditions and can be terribly destabilizing. It was interesting that, as Sherry said, the military was not in charge. No, we were there to provide organizational capability and try and keep the violence down. By the way, one of the problems we never solved was whether open carry or concealed carry was going to be possible inside Mogadishu for the Somalis, but that's another long story. But these problems don't get better, and they don't have a cookie cutter solution to it. This is going to be really something. And as far as what the Biden administration can do, this is a global problem. And the only near peer previous episode I can think of in this was Franklin Roosevelt convening the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire before we were sure that we were going to win the war. And he gathered 700 and some delegates there so we could strong arm them into, and it was an isolated place then, there was nothing to do. So, you know, he chose this brilliantly, besides the fact that he needed the vote of a New Hampshire senator to get something done that he wanted done. But the Bretton Woods system that came out of that was arguably what kept the world from tipping into a third world war in the second half of the 20th century. It was not easy because we came out of that with an anti-colonial stance, which really irritated the British and the French, who were our close allies, but we forced that through. Not everything that was invented at Bretton Woods survived, but the system survived in most form. And it was a big deal, and it went forward, and it changed the world. We got away from autocratic governments. We got away from colonialism. We got away from preferential trade arrangements, all of which I think you can make an argument. If this is as big as we think it is, and it appears to be with climate change, we can make no small plans. We need to go big. And I don't know whether we've got the ability to do that, but it's going to have to be something where we're taking care of the people who feel they're going to be displaced by green technology and all these things. There's ways to do this, but it's not going to be able to be done by half measures, in my opinion. And we're going to have to make a major diplomatic, political, energy, infrastructure, education, all integrated idea on this. So the administration is talking about one thing that's interesting, a civilian conservation corps. This gets real close to universal service. We could take everybody coming out of high school, and I don't care if you go into Marine Corps, Peace Corps, Head Start, Conservation Corps, you're going to do something for your country for a year or so. One, you get a labor force. Two, you get sort of a nation building effort out of it. It might be worth considering. We're falling behind the rest of the world on science, technology, engineering, and math education. We need to do something about that. There's talk about making public schools accessible to all, but private schools like Harvard and Amherst and others that have been mentioned today can continue to do what they do. Money's not their issue. Those types of things. We need, we need to dream big here. This is not something that's going to be solved by piecemeal efforts.
Wow. I mean, I think that, so you made a great case for a sort of new round of big thinking about multilateralism and universal service and the importance of STEM education. When you talk about Bretton Woods, we are talking about thinking big, going big. And it raises an important question. I'll just turn over maybe to Cynthia
But let me get one other piece
yeah,
in here, if I
please.
may. If Bretton Woods was made to solve the problems, the conditions, to get rid of the conditions that led to both World War I and World War II, and arguably it succeeded. The Cold War was hot in many places, but we didn't have another global war. Then this is a similar global organization problem, a global norm problem. And who better to lead this but us?
Thank you very much. And as you pointed out, that this is a huge, if it's as big as many people think, a growing number of people think, and I think that the sixth assessment report will suggest that it is that big.
One more thought, and then I promise this is it. But we have a all of us, as a nation, as a government, as people, have a hard time seeing what's happening right in front of us. And this is going to require some effort to get this through. We recently saw a failure to see what was right in front of us on January 6th. You read the headlines today, everybody's blaming oh, we didn't have any intelligence on this. We had about 60 days of vitriol and rhetoric and armed demonstrations at the government state houses across the nation, and we didn't see this coming. Oh, the intel agencies didn't show us this? No, it's a government problem. So from small, the January 6th incidents, to big, with what we're talking about today, we need to grasp it, hold it, and go big on it. Make no small plans.
I think that you set up the challenge in a very clear way. And going big on climate change means, for example, moving towards a new energy economy, dramatically trying to reduce emissions and conserve water and protect carbon storage and manage demand and so on. And there is a risk in doing this that we will create winners and losers economically and bring some turbulence to different parts of the world. People talk now about a green resource curse, about the impact on those countries that are supplying vital elements for batteries and so on and so forth. So Cynthia, maybe since you have so much experience in international development, maybe you can build on what General Gregson has said and share your thoughts on what we can do to ensure that when we attack climate change from a technical and economic perspective, we are not doing things that create social sort of turbulence and misunderstanding and hostility and division. How do we manage these two things, people and the climate, going forward from your perspective as a development expert?
Thank you for the question, Richard. In my head, I'm trying to draw on some of the things that were said by all the speakers before me, because they all feed into part of what I think I would offer as the answer. Let's start with Chip's last comment about thinking big. And I think this is sometimes part of the real challenge for all the institutions mandated to respond to these things. It's always about systems. Those narrow technical fixes are never quite enough. There are all these different dynamics: climate change, political instability, human mobility happening that are influencing one another all the time. And we have to keep our eye on how each of these different variables are influencing one another in real time, alongside of some predictive capability into the future, so we don't work ourselves into a problem. So one part of how we avoid making things worse, I think, is really being mindful of the systems and the larger contexts in which we are working, and helping ourselves not be quite so technically narrow in our solution sets. which harkens back to what Sherry was talking about earlier, really trying to not think about development, for example, as a narrow set of humanitarian aid interventions or economic development interventions, but to think about how those things are related to larger questions of foreign policy in the countries where those things are happening. For example, environmental peace building is the perfect frame for helping us bring two of those dimensions together into the same conversation and bring together institutions that deal with different components of that, whether it's military Department of Defense, USAID and development actors, State Department and diplomacy actors, all into that frame together. So I think part of how we do this better is, one, keeping our eye on systems thinking and really trying to think more creatively about how we find maybe non-traditional entry points for action. So that's one part of it. I think the other is something that Tegan was talking about, and remembering the human beings and individuals that are that comprise the context in which we're working. Something as specific as a person's decision to move. To the migration question is not really a nation state question. It goes down much lower than that. And you really have to be mindful that any individual or any family's decision to move is going to be informed by their own context, their own needs. And we have to be thinking about community level interventions, not just the big picture, which is sort of the other side of that frame, from systems thinking down to more individual and community level thinking. And to me, it means we're really talking about human security issues all the time. We're talking about physical security, livelihoods, economic stability, all of it, human dignity. Those are all a part of the security frame, and we should be thinking and talking about those issues. What else do I want to say about this? Yeah, as an example from the development space, and it's probably worth mentioning for USAID, usually more than half of our interventions are happening, somewhere between 50 and 60% of the interventions are happening in countries affected by conflict and fragility. So that's most of the places USAID is working. For the purposes of this conversation, I would highlight two specific environment-focused dimensions of that. One is that under the Water for the Poor Act, about 90% of the priority countries where USAID is working are affected by fragility and conflict, and traditionally somewhere around 80% of climate adaptation focused priority countries were also conflict affected or fragile. So the majority of places where USAID is making these interventions are going to have to grapple with that pre-existing context, which means that as we make our investments in climate adaptation and improved water management, we also have to always be thinking about the political context and the economic context. And we have to think above all about the state-society relationship in the places where we're going to be working. And remember that the institutions that are responsible for the interventions are, we have to be thinking about whether or not those institutions are trusted by the population, whether they are considered effective in their ability to deliver services and support, whether they're considered legitimate. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. And you know, everybody is sort of just pushing this conversation forward. We have a lot of questions that have been raised, and I'm going to start to get to some of those in a second. But first, I want to turn to Aaron, and I want to ask a question. Given your extensive experience in government, and I know that Sherry and Chip will also have important perspectives on this. But for years, for 10 or 15 years or longer, we have heard variations of the argument that if we're going to take on these global challenges like climate change, if we're going to do that, we would be far more effective if we could break down some of the silos and some of the budgets and encourage more coordination, more communication, more collaboration across different agencies and elements of our own government and, beyond. And I'm thinking about arguments. I remember years ago, I forget the exact, when they first were introduced, but arguments about, with reference to bringing together defense and diplomacy and development assistance that I think Secretary Clinton was associated with. But the World Economic Forum has talked about the importance of breaking down silos and moving towards what they call a water, energy, food, climate nexus approach to solving problems. And the UN has been talking for several years about a humanitarian development peace nexus and breaking down barriers and silos and moving forward. And so let me start with you, Aaron, and then also invite Sherry and Chip to weigh in a little bit on this. But is this breaking down of silos and trying to find ways to coordinate activities and to sort of reduce this sort of competition for protecting budgets? Is this a path forward? And if it is a path forward, why does it seem, and maybe I'm wrong, but why does it seem like it moving from rhetoric to execution has been very difficult? Like what are the obstacles? If this makes sense, what prohibits us from doing it? And so, Aaron, I'd like you to weigh in, because I know that you did it. You led an effort to do exactly this.
Yeah, and I think certainly love to hear Sherry about some of these issues. She's at the forefront of trying to address some of these very challenges. I mean, it really gets to the heart of the issue, and that is, bureaucratically, are we structured in a way that allows us to respond to these very complex sets of challenges? And some of this has to do with the alignment of money, mandate, and people. And Sherry mentioned some of this, that the party who's responsible for this mission is given the financial or staff resources to be able to accomplish the mission. And how do you put those things into the same place? And this is particularly true when the teams that you need to solve these very complicated problems have to include a wide variety of expertise that often exists across the US government in many different shapes and forms. But the building, the managing, and the financing of an interagency response represents a real challenge, and how you make that work within our bureaucracy can be a real challenge. And sometimes it often requires navigating competing congressional mandates as well. And that too can be an impediment to our ability to execute in the integrated way that we would like to. Some of this has to do with the short timeframes that we look at solving problems in 4-year cycles, which can interfere with our ability to provide the parties the time and space to work through difficult challenges. An important step in many peace building processes, especially when there have been past harms or long-standing systemic inequalities, is the concept of apology, forgiveness, and reconciliation. And these are places that parties often have to get to in their own way and in their own time frame, which may not be consistent with our own measures of success. And so that can be a real challenge, is dealing with the short time frames that we often work within inside of governments. And sometimes this has to do with how we measure results. Getting to an agreement is not the same necessarily as building the capacity among the parties to identify and solve their own disagreements. And so how we build the capacity of parties to collect, to use evidence, to negotiate, to solve disputes, all lay the foundation for solving complex problems that require significant trade-offs in the future. And these process outcomes are something that we should be designing for upfront and recognize as important as getting to the final agreement or the final set of outcomes that we were looking for in our programming. And so how we embed those types of process outcomes that we're building the capacity for long-term sustained success, particularly in peace building operations, I think is critically important.
And that's a fantastic answer, Aaron. And I don't know if you have a view, but I'm just going to introduce, before I turn to Sherry, because you're right, she has tremendous experience in exactly this, a question from the audience. And that is that, do you think that the Biden administration has the sort of knowledge and skills, is putting together knowledge and skills in state, in defense, in AID, and so on, that would successfully place climate change at the center of US foreign policy and national security? Should we be optimistic about what we're seeing take place right now?
Yeah, I think certainly the senior leadership teams that he's putting in place embody a lot of these very principles, and I think understand these issues very, very well. And so I think there's reason to be hopeful. As the next 6 months, 9 months play out, we begin to staff up the agencies at lower levels. That's where the rubber's really going to meet the road. Do we have the right people in place who understand, the importance of process, they understand the importance of interagency collaboration and coordination on these, and can really work together across their agency boundaries to solve these really complicated problems. So that's where the rubber's really going to meet the road. And we have to, I think we've got the right leadership in place. We have to be hopeful that carries on to the other appointments that happen within the agencies and the way they staff up the professional staff as well. I mean, it really is the line staff. It's the people at our missions, at US embassies and missions overseas that are really driving this work. They're the closest people on the ground. They understand these problems better than anybody. And so turning to our mission directors and our ambassadors for real leadership, giving them the opportunity to mobilize expertise from across the interagency community as they need it to support their programming and their efforts, and to be able to think in longer term time horizons, I think are going to be critically important. So the more we can empower our field folks to be able to bring that expertise in, I think the better off we'll be.
Thank you very much. And Sherry, you were tasked with doing something sort of big picture and unique, thinking about the environment from sort of base cleanup and so on to something much, much larger and much more important. And you were put into the center of a remarkable period of time, Cold War ending, lots of thinking about what were the implications for defense, for national security, for our military. How could we take advantage of this opportunity to change? And I'd love to have you share your thoughts about the challenges of coordination and communication and collaboration that everybody seems to believe are essential if we're going to put the skill set together to make real progress on dealing with climate change and so on.
Great, thank you very much, Richard, and to all the panelists. Great comments. So reflecting back on my own experience, I'll tell 3 short stories where I think this worked, and there are 2 really fundamental principles that apply in each one of them. The first is leadership from the top matters, right? So it has to be a priority, ideally of the president, but if not, at least of the cabinet or administration head, okay? Because that makes a lot, that breaks a lot of this, does some of the initial de-icing on the stovepipes that naturally exist in bureaucracies. The second is things have to move at the speed of trust, so you have to build trusting relationships with the people you're working with on the interagency basis. Ideally, you get some support from Congress if you need it for your particular program area. And the other trust is kind of with the stakeholders in the communities. And I'll give you 3 short examples where this applied. So you mentioned base closures. In my era, in the 90s, we were closing a lot of military bases in the US and some overseas as well. And we had to clean them up. And the president had, as part of his 5-part plan to clean up, to revitalize closing base communities, that we were going to fast track the cleanup. Well, cleanup of bases isn't usually that fast because there are a lot of steps you have to go through with your environmental regulators, both federal and state. Well, EPA said, well, we'll work with you, but we don't have the money to sort of keep up with your pace unless you give us some funding. So we actually gave, I gave the EPA about $7 million a year for a couple of years in the 90s to keep pace with our fast track cleanup for closing bases. That was sort of unheard of, that DOD would give its TOA over to another agency, particularly an environmental regulator who had the ability to fine us. But that was how we got stuff done. And we also built trust and cooperation by working that way. Secondly, in the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Program, which was a global effort to sort of to reduce nuclear waste streams from decommissioned Russian submarines, again, that was a priority of the Secretary of Defense because the the Minister of Defense of Norway said this is a major threat, leaking Russian submarines, contaminating our fishing grounds, put together a program. Okay, again, we provided funding, even though DOD didn't actually have any funding to do this. We took it out of Hyde, but we also provided funding to the Departments of Energy and EPA, I think, or the others, to help us sort of partner with them and to help work with the Norwegians and the Russians. And third, and last, this Defense Environmental International Environmental Cooperation Program, which still exists in the Department of Defense and could be lifted up as the 2.0 I mentioned earlier. That program served to advance mill-to-mill environmental cooperation, but on a much broader basis. And it's now, the funding that still exists is used at, for example, the COCOMs like Pacific Command, where they do environmental security forums on a regular basis. And they bring in USAID folks and state and Coast Guard and FEMA and NOAA and others, and also it's international. And that kind of support done at a combatant command level, or as Aaron and maybe others mentioned also, through embassies potentially, could be used to sort of lift up, do some of this engagement. And it has to be built sort of at the right local level with the trusted partners, both the US host country, and then ideally NGOs and local stakeholders as well.
Sherry, thanks so much. And you know, having personally served on UN missions in Congo and Rwanda and Sierra Leone, I can tell you my own experience can reaffirms the importance of building trust. And before I turn to General Gregson, let me just ask you a question that's come up with the audience. What are the prospects for the US to rebuild trust globally in these fragile areas, both nationally and you know, subnationally? Do you feel that we lost ground recently? I think a lot of people do. And if we have lost ground, what do we need to do as a country to try and rebuild that trust? Because you're right, it doesn't happen overnight. People don't suddenly trust you because you send a new face into the meeting. What do we need to do to rebuild trust beyond our borders? And so I was just wondering, Sherry, if you had some thoughts about rebuilding trust beyond our borders. And I think you're muted, so I think that's what we're.
Sorry, yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think the US has to come back with humility because we've set the wrong tone for the last 4 years. So I think we have to recognize that. And then we have to realize we're not coming back to the world the way it was even 4 or 10 years ago. The world has changed. And I think the perception sometimes by Americans, particularly in foreign policy, national security, is particularly my generation. You know, we grew up with the US as the kind of global leader, and we love that era because that's how we were trained in the Cold War. But that era's passed. And you know, we have to think of our other partners either as both as more equal and also bringing other capabilities that maybe we don't have. So it requires a set of skills, I think, that perhaps we weren't always trained. You know, we always thought, oh, there's a great demand signal for American leadership. And I think now people want us back at the table, but not necessarily leading to the exception of others. We even saw how Macron reacted to the recent meeting with that President Biden attended, you know, talking about, you know, the whole strategic engagement that, you know, the Europeans need to have on their own now. And so I think we have to realize that more and more is going to be the case, particularly in Asia with China. We have to, that's a very tough nut to crack. We have to work on that very, very hard. But again, it's not just by coming in and it's by saying we're back, but not just by saying we're back. Okay, everyone else shut up. You know, we have to listen now, do a lot of listening and working and being willing to sort of convene and humbly and in ways we haven't always thought about.
Thank you. And you know, your points about humility about being back, but also recognizing that the world has changed. It is changing. It's in many ways rapidly changing. There are tools and there are things that we can do now, technologically, for example, that we could not even really do 5 or 10 years ago. But let me turn back to General Gregson. And the Marines have evolved over the past 35, 40 years through various initiatives to cooperate more, or to assume new roles, to assume new missions. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about working together, collaborating, and also what we need to do to make sure that we're rebuilding trust so that we can bring leadership onto the world stage on this issue.
I like Sherry's prescription about we have to approach this with some humility, and the door's been opened with anecdotes by me and other speakers, and a couple may help illustrate what I think I'm talking about. I was in Malaysia in the capital, and it was, big guys making speeches, and it wasn't my speech, fortunately, but it was somebody else. I think it was Denny Blair. And coffee break, and I was accosted by this very large person at the coffee mess saying, I come to all these things to hear about Asia and the Pacific, but all you guys ever talk about is Asia. And I said, and where are you from? And the answer was Fiji. Okay, I get it. We've got, we have a tendency to treat the great part of the Pacific Ocean as flyover territory while we're on our way to someplace interesting like Singapore or something. Consequently, China has made a lot of gains out there because we're not looking that direction and we're not paying attention. And these are areas, in many cases, that belong to us. The Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, it's treated like a territory. It's a complex relationship, but people in the Commonwealth have American passports. The Chinese have casino diplomacy going on there, and they're providing jobs and wealth for the locals. And their message, the Chinese are great at political warfare. Their message is you can have us and you can have all these tourists coming in here and spending money, or you can have the Marines. You can't have both. That type of thing. Palau still recognizes Taiwan. They're punished for this by China. The president of Palau has been calling for us to establish some sort of presence. It could be intermittent, it could be episodic, but just some sort of presence of American officialdom in Palau, including people in uniform, the Lance Corporal, just to show that we know where it is and that and to help him with governance of his own territory. And stories like that are all over the place. The Prime Minister of Vanuatu offered us the chance to return to Espiritu Santo and put a base in there. We might not want to put a base in there, but we should have at least answered his letter, and we didn't. So these types of things. Tip O'Neill said all politics is local, and boy is it. And I used to remark when I was privileged to serve out there that a general going around and sipping tea with other generals in the Philippines or any place or other places like that is useless unless you got people on the ground doing something valuable for the Philippines. And there's a benefit to this for the military too. When the war on terror was popular, we had people preaching saying, "Oh, we got to teach the troops how to be culturally sensitive." Like what? Put them in an overheated classroom and show them PowerPoint slides on being culturally sensitive, or just getting them embedded with other societies. We've got a lot of opportunities here, but to paraphrase what Sherry said, we got to get over ourselves, and we got to start reaching out to people on a people-to-people level, eyeball to eyeball, handshake to handshake, and the rest of the programs will start to fall into place then.
Thank you, General. And let me see on this issue of sort of interagency cooperation and cooperation beyond our borders, building trust, and making sure that our view of the world is up to date. I'm wondering if Tegan or Cynthia or Aaron have some thoughts to share on this. Maybe start with you, Tegan. And if not, that's fine. I can, but if yes, just put your mic on and.
Well, I must admit that that question ties into another question that I saw from one of the participants. And so do you mind if I kind of join something else in?
Please do.
There was a question about what role adaptation should play in the negotiations. And in terms of thinking about partnership and how we build new partnerships, I think, at least in the context of climate change, beginning to build partnerships around adaptation is going to be absolutely critical for building US credibility, again, within the context of the negotiations and globally. What Sherry was saying about the world has changed and we need to enter with a spirit of humility and a spirit of willingness, to me is absolutely critical in the context of the UN negotiations on climate change. And focusing on adaptation and being willing to listen to the issues that countries are wrestling with, to actually hear them and to hear what they think they need in terms of support, in order to move forward, is one place that I think we could really begin building partnership internationally that will help us as a globe be more successful on climate change issues. And especially for the United States, re-entering an agreement like that with global ramifications, where the United States has been mostly absent for 4 years, and coming in with a spirit of being willing to listen and being willing to learn and to hear the priorities of many countries around the world, I think is one way that we start building partnerships and really start building an understanding of the issues that other countries are wrestling with and how we help meet their needs moving forward. I do think that that's going to help us in so many different ways, in different discussions, not just in Paris, but in other diplomatic and other development and other diplomacy or defense discussions as well, being able to hear where countries are coming from on issues that are absolutely critical, starting to build a partnership.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm wondering, Aaron, do you have anything to add to this?
For me, it's simple. Sherry Tegan already said it, be present and be a partner. And, we just need to be present in the full meaning of the word in many of these places around the world. It takes a long time to establish those relationships. If you're going to work on peace building activities, there's a lot of trust that needs to happen to be invited into those kinds of processes. And you just need to be present, and you need to be present for long periods of time for that type of, for you to be able to be effective in those types of environments. And so that's something, hopefully we'll get a chance to wrap up with a couple of additional points on peace building around that area. But to me, that's the most important part, present in partnerships.
And let me maybe turn to Cynthia, and there is a question from the audience about, are there examples of the US being engaged in environmental peace building? What would be an example of where we've got some experience doing this, and what can you share about that experience so far? It's a wonderful concept. What have we done so far? It's not a new concept.
Richard, I'll wrap that into part of my response. So
yes.
I was thinking about two things. One, as we appropriately talk about our sense of humility as the United States coming to the table, both at the level of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, but also in terms of adaptation programs or mitigation programs with partner countries and partner communities around the world. I think that same sense of being certain that we don't think we're arriving at the table with the answer. One is always looking for what existing coping capacities there are and what sources of resilience to change are already in place in communities that we are working with. I think we really need to bring that same sense of really open-minded listening to understand problems from the perspectives of those who are affected most by them, whether that's at, again, sort of the development community perspective of local level communities, or whether it's the United States coming to the negotiating table with other countries around the world. That's one. Make sure that we don't define the problem for others, but that we seek to understand their perspective. And that includes not only the problem assessment, but the solution assessment as well. And if we don't do that together with partners and with those who are affected by these issues directly, then we'll miss out on understanding where there are existing capacities that we could strengthen, where there are yeah, exactly. Those sources of resilience, which don't need to be replaced and certainly don't need to be undermined by well-meaning but misdirected solution sets that are being brought in from the outside. An example that I was thinking of in this area helps answer the question that came in from a speaker about what's an example of an actual environmental peace building program on the ground. The one that I had in mind was not in any way framed as an environmental peace building program, but it is a peace building program which happened to deal with natural resource management issues. So in Yemen, the most water scarce country in the Middle East, I think there is a sort of preeminent view that violent conflict is inevitable because they're going to run out of water and people are going to fight over it. In one particular development program, there was an effort to develop community peace building committees. And those committees were really about helping people find ways to talk to one another, to negotiate their respective interests and find solutions to their problems. And in this case, it had to do with water management. And it would have been inaccurate to assume that the reason that there was existing violent conflict was over the physical resource itself and its scarcity. The reason that people were really coming into direct conflict with one another was over the sense of inequality about the distribution of the available resource. So in that case, it turned out to be incredibly effective to help people have platforms and opportunities to come together to figure out how to create a more equal distribution of what was objectively an increasingly scarce resource in an increasingly more acute and stressed situation. But when you approach it from this perspective of finding out how to use whatever natural resource, in this case water, there is, in a way that feels as fair as it can be under the circumstances and where people's respective interests can be met, then you will find out on the other side that you generally have, one, a more efficient management of the resource itself, and you also have people who are able to coexist in a peaceful way as they share that resource. So that's one example. And hopefully it also makes this point about ensuring that we're using the systems that already exist in the communities that we're working with to help manage new, different, and sometimes more strong stresses and pressures on those systems. The other thing I wanted to mention was with respect to how do we help the Biden administration moving forward be as effective as it can be, bringing together these worlds and communities of practice. And some of my other panelists were rightly talking about the Framework Convention on Climate Change and Paris. One of the things as a peace builder that I would certainly advocate for is that we use those processes to very intentionally build in not only the requirement to bring issues of conflict sensitivity, the context of fragility that many countries are struggling with to the table, but also to incentivize it. Make sure that there is, make sure that those conversations aren't existing in separate silos. Bring the world of conflict and fragility to the world of how we are planning forward for adaptation and mitigation. And I would definitely argue, I think it was Sherry who brought up financing mechanisms. Erin did too, actually. And that is, feels like a really kind of banal and administrative point that has more impact than almost anything. You can't develop something like the Green Climate Fund and not think about the context of the countries in which those resources are going to be distributed. You have to build into the mechanism itself and into the processes for its distribution and the implementation, a sensitivity to conflict, a sensitivity to fragility, an awareness that the institutions who are going to be receiving that money in country X, Y, or Z may not have the absorptive capacity that they need, or may not have the particular relationships with affected populations that they need for it all to go off smoothly and without a hitch. So one argument I would make is for sure that we bring the world of peace building to the table in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. The other is that we think real hard and real specifically about the financing mechanisms that are going to support those processes and make sure that we bring the world of peace building to that table as well. And then the last point I would make is just on the opposite side of the equation. In the United States, we now have the Global Fragility Act and the Global Fragility Strategy, which are focusing on the peace building and conflict side of the equation. We should absolutely make sure that we are likewise bringing the world of climate change and the requirement to be aware of and to track the climate resiliency of investments in those countries as well. So I think there is an institutional and a process place where we can bring these two worlds of environment and peace building together. And then there are also places in the real world on the ground, such as the example in Yemen that I pointed out, where these worlds come together.
Thank you,
Richard. I know we're short on time, but can I follow up for a quick second?
Absolutely.
Because I think Cynthia's points are really, really important. And in my view, really provide an important opportunity for how we think about these issues going forward. Somebody asked the question of, is there an example? And we need to turn this around a little bit. Environmental issues, in many respects, can provide the ideal platform for peace building. In many of these complicated regions, there's often a common need and an interest in ensuring access to basic services like energy, clean drinking water, sanitation, and in ensuring the sustainability of environmental resources that protect lives and livelihoods. And so the environment, these shared interests can bring people together. They can create the space for shared visioning, for joint data collection and analysis, for trainings and activities that can build capacity and demonstrate that collective work can lead to successes, that can strengthen social cohesion and regional integration, that can provide opportunities for apologies, forgiveness, and reconciliation. But this really only happens, and Cynthia said this, but I really want to drive it home. It really only happens if we're focused on some of these process outcomes as ends rather than just the means to an end or to an agreement. And that we're consciously using some of these peace building processes to build the capacity, the relationships, and the political will for sustained cooperation in these regions. And so that when we walk away, the parties can solve these kinds of challenges and problems on their own without this type of external intervention.
Thank you, Aaron. I couldn't agree more. And you also, I think, you've created a great segue into some of the questions that people are raising. And let me and I'm going to try and get to some of these questions because they're really interesting. They're what's on our audience's mind. And I'll start with one that's sort of obvious, but get a sense of how important you all feel it is. But one person raises the question: we're talking about the importance of peace building and climate action and so on. To what extent would it be much easier for us if we were doing a little more at home? From the world's perspective, we didn't manage COVID-19 particularly well. We're watching Texas being overwhelmed by, a severe weather event. We know that from Florida to California, there's tremendously large number of people at risk of severe weather events and heat waves and droughts and floods. And underlying a lot of this, the American Society of Civil Engineers has said that overall US infrastructure rates a D+. And what they mean by that is we're not very resilient and we're not very well set up to manage the stresses and shocks that people are predicting with climate change. To what extent do we have to get our own house in order to have more leverage, or can we do the two simultaneously? Can we listen to the world and learn and move forward and also invest in not only into the world's problems, but our own problems at the same time? I think this is an important question. I'd love to get, and what I'd like to do now is just allow anybody on the panel to weigh in as we run through, half a dozen of these questions from the audience. But what about the state of our own vulnerability and concerns that it's growing and that the bottom half of America is really, really at high risk of flood and heat wave and drought and infectious disease and so on. And I don't know, Aaron, if you have some thoughts, because you sort of led us towards this very nicely, but I invite anybody to weigh in.
Well, it's certainly not helpful to be performing badly domestically. But I still think that U.S. expertise and knowledge is highly sought after across the world. I think people do want to engage our experts, and I still think they do want to see us at the table. So we do need to get our house in order, and I think that enabling state-led efforts to address some of these challenges is an important start in making sure that states and others have the tools to be able to address particularly challenges around the sustainability of our water and energy infrastructure. I think it's going to be critical. I think, and that's for a broader set of reasons, I don't necessarily see that as a huge impediment to advancing some of our agenda internationally. I really do think people still want to hear from us and see us at the table.
Do other panelists have a perspective on the links between what we're doing at home and what we can do abroad? Sherry.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the Texas crisis and others have shown how much lacking in resilience our own infrastructure is. We've known that for a while, but now with climate extremes and extreme weather irregular occurrence, it's really stressing our aging infrastructure and showing that it's not climate resilient. Okay, so we need to invest here at home. We're going to be drawing on technologies, talents, and expertise of others around the world as we do that. I mean, we are going to, President Biden is going to, wants to buy American, and that's all happening. But, we've learned a lot from the Dutch, right? For example, on how to manage floods. And we've learned from, Israel and from other countries around the world too. So I think, we have to be open to receiving the expertise and insights from others. But then I also agree with Aaron that still our presence is, for the most part, welcome back in global forums, and that as we build back better and rebuild our economy and our infrastructure on ways more reliant on clean energy and climate tech, we can begin exporting this innovation in ways that make the U.S. globally competitive in these areas, but also offer it as tools in environmental peace building in the right circumstances. And some of that's the climate predictability at local scales for decision making on agriculture and fishing and local livelihoods that need those tools that need to be available, so local decision makers can have the data and the tools necessary to make their own decisions. And I think the U.S. is still going to be at the forefront of developing some of that. That's going to be pairing, climate data and science with sort of Silicon Valley AI and tech innovation.
Fantastic. Anyone else? Or maybe I'll get into some of these other questions because we don't have a lot of time. One question that's risen, we talk a lot about financing. I think the world is at a point where it's thinking about creative financing, about public-private partnerships, about urban wealth assets, about various environmental and climate and social bonds and so on. One question that's come up is that Secretary of Defense Gates proposed a dual funding program between state and Department of Defense on issues of mutual concern, based on a similar program in the UK. It didn't go anywhere. Should that proposal be revived? Is that the sort of mechanism that we're thinking about to help us make progress? Any view on the?
Sorry, I'm looking at Sherry. I mean,
well,
yes,
Bob
yes, and yes, right? I mean,
yeah, of course. Bob and
right.
Bob Barnes put that question in there, and of course I agree with it. In a perfect world, even in a perfect administration, let's say state and defense with AID could come together and say, okay, we want to pool our resources on environmental peace building or whatever it is. Okay, you'd still have to get Congress. If the number was anything big enough, you'd have to get Congress to agree. And then you'd get into a whole effort of, can you deal with the jurisdiction of congressional committees? And while I think it's a worthy effort, and there may be some places where we could do that, I wouldn't want to lose the momentum, particularly the first 2 years of an administration where you've got, you know, the same party controlling all 3 branches of Congress. You got to get a lot done in these 2 years, right? And it's still pretty tight. And so I wouldn't want to waste my effort on that. I would, if I couldn't get it done, then I would rather have used sort of, you know, agency funds distributed, as I gave those examples where we included other agencies in that, and then use it and try to do it that way so that we could build that momentum and then build the support to, let's say, through the Defense Environmental International Cooperation Program or others that I may not even know about, to be these kind of interagency. There are others out there, even in state, there are some that have these interagency approaches that bring people together. Aaron, I think you know
well,
some.
and you're not talking about a lot of money, right? If you're talking about the funding that enables you to manage a multi-agency process, I mean, the traditional funding mechanisms can work absolutely fine for supporting the activities that we're talking about. It's how you have the very modest amount of resources that's necessary to execute a peace building mission, to pull together the teams, to put the person out in the field, to mobilize that one expert from the Army Corps of Engineers that you need for the 2 months to provide the technical input to move a conversation forward in the field. You know, it's a modest amounts of money that can be programmed in a rapid, quick way that enables you to provide that interagency support. That doesn't mean that you want to do that with absent of the long-term funding streams that exist in DoD, state, and USAID. You want to blend those in. But sometimes that interagency coordination process just needs a little bit of glue, and funding for that can be helpful.
Cynthia, please. And you're muted. Yeah.
Sorry, I know the mute button. I just wanted to add one thing, sort of maybe adjacent to that funding question, which is acknowledging that each of the US government institutions has their own mandate. And one of the things that can then be really helpful, jumping off of Aaron's last point, is the problem analysis, making sure that you do have the processes that allow for interagency shared problem analysis and things like data sharing, et cetera, but then allowing for the reality that institutions will have to go back within their own respective world, their own parameters of operation, and carry out their investments in helping to solve the problems, whatever that may be, and using their own financial mechanisms to do so. But if we can do a better job as the US government of creating the interagency spaces where we can have a more holistic understanding of the problem that we're trying to solve and a more honest conversation about which agencies have the greatest strengths in certain areas, and maybe then acknowledge their not so great strengths in other ways, and agree that the agencies should be able to go back to the operations part of solving things in their own lanes, but to do it in a way that's much more coherent, in a way that has a much stronger collaborative element and is more towards helping to solve a shared understanding of the problem.
So
Let's just say if Cynthia and Aaron and Chip and I don't know if you served Tegan, but if we were all back in government again, we would play nice in the sandbox and work well together, trust and cooperation among our various agencies.
That's great to hear. So how do we get you all back into the administration? Another thing, trust and relationships, working together, finding ways to leverage funding to do things. Another question that has come up, and it's an important question. I'll ask Chip his views on it, because I think it fits well into the military. But it is, how do we improve our ability, one person from the eyes, to scan the horizon using these powerful technologies? We have made enormous gains in managing big data. We can use structured and unstructured data effectively. We can layer data on. We can integrate local knowledge and different perspectives. We can run scenarios much more cheaply than in the past. And that not only allows us to sort of see trade-offs and stakeholders, but it also allows us to reduce uncertainties in a lot of situations. Are we using big data? Are we using technological tools? Because the fact that we have them doesn't mean that they're guiding policy or creating, shared understandings of what our problems are. sharing data is not always that easy. Sharing models and understandings is not always that easy across government. So are we using these powerful technologies effectively, given that we've, Department of Defense and the private sector have helped develop these powerful tools? Are we using them effectively to get ahead of these problems? And maybe I'll start off with you, Chip, but open it up to everybody.
We're getting there. I wouldn't say that we're entirely comfortable with exploiting big data like you're talking about, but that is coming because autonomy and autonomous systems are going to be more and more needed. Inside the defense empire, things like doctrine and all that are very, very stubborn things. It's hard to get them changed, and this one will be no easier than any other previous changes. But we're being forced to. We have airplanes that collect far more data than we can analyze. And the answer is not recruiting 800 more people to analyze the data. The answer is artificial intelligence, build a layer on this to turn it into information to understanding, all those things. It's a work in progress, I think we can say.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I mean, this is kind of the example of water everywhere, but not a drop to drink, right? I mean, I think we're drowning in data, but the real question, and I think this is right, are we giving decision makers the data they need in the right format at the right time to inform decision making? And when you look at it that way, I really wonder if we're failing, especially in low resource settings. We still need to produce data and science that matters. We need peer-reviewed science and analysis so that we can begin to strip away a lot of the myths that often dominate disputes and can create a common understanding of the challenges and opportunities that exist. And there are opportunities to, I think, be incredibly transformational. I'll give you an example. In my world, data such as that, which will soon be available from NASA's Surface Water and Ocean Topography mission, which will be launched in 2022. This has the potential to be transformational in this sector by allowing public access to river levels, reservoir levels, discharge rates for every major river in the world. And this would happen overnight. Right. And if it was done in the right way, we could present that information to people so they could take that on board in a meaningful way. It could fundamentally transform not only how countries are managing their water resources, but the relationships between and among countries over shared water resources. And so I think there are tremendous opportunities around data, but it's getting it in the right places, in the right way, in the right format. That said, though, I do want to add a cautionary note, because I think we often make the mistake of saying that all data is good, and particularly in conflict situations. Data from external sources is rarely seen as objective. And you don't want to miss the opportunity that data provides in bringing parties together. Engaging the parties in the data collection, in the analysis process is critically important, not only to have buy-in, but to build a dialogue process between the parties. And whether or not the answer they get is right, that's almost not even important. Whether or not the actual solution they've all agreed to, but the fact that they've worked together to come up with a thoughtful way of jointly analyzing a problem and collecting that data and analyzing it and coming up with a number, that in and of itself represents a huge step forward in many conflict resolution processes, and something we should be shooting for and using data for. Using that data process as a tool in peace building is something we shouldn't forget.
Do you think, Aaron, and this is a question that has just come up, the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center in DoD, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, but should that be given a specific mandate in environmental security, international climate adaptation issues?
Yes, in looking at forecasting, in being able to understand what current and future conditions might look like, where people are moving, what the different social, environmental, political factors are at play that are going to come together that might create areas that we need to pay more attention to. Absolutely.
Chip, please.
Fully endorse Aaron's eloquent description of this. A great place to exercise this environmental study, international climate adaptation, I submit, will be the Mekong River Basin. the 9 dams that China has constructed on the upper reaches of the Mekong are fundamentally changing the downstream Mekong. That affects all the countries in Southeast Asia. And if we want to look at a place where we can use big data to maybe start predicting what's going to happen so we can take action before the event, the Mekong River Basin, I would nominate as one place we could do that.
Well, in fact, sorry to pile on, there's a good example of a program that's currently being funded by the Department of State with the Stimson Center, where they're publishing, using remote sensing data, they're publishing estimated reservoir levels for the dams in China. China has now engaged in a better discussion with the Mekong River Commission, knowing that that data is out there about how they're managing those dams. And so the publication of that information, publicly available information, is now creating an environment where, guess what, there aren't many choices, right? Everybody can see what's going on now. So now you've got a more reasoned conversation happening between the parties. So Chip's exactly right.
And we really do need a panel with policymakers, with the new administration, with the audience about the potential of big data, what it can do, what we're able to do with it now, the ways in which we can integrate different streams of data, provide real-time information, provide projections, but also how to use this responsibly, how to not fall into the trap of creating the impression that we know everything when we don't, and so on and so forth, and how to get appropriate information to the people who have to make decisions. To me, that's an enormous topic, and if we can move towards that, that would I think also probably help in terms of building trust, building partnerships with a technical and scientific world beyond our borders as well as within it, and finding ways to fund this. We're almost at the end, and what I would love to do is invite each person, give each person about a minute to share any last thoughts they have about the priorities and so on, what this current administration, and Sherry pointed out, it's got to act quickly, it's got to do something in the next couple of years, even though we've all agreed that that's not a great time frame to be thinking about many of the solutions. But let me start, I guess, with you, Tegan, if you're comfortable, to sort of share some final thoughts for what the new administration needs to be thinking about and doing as quickly as possible. And I'll go around quickly to everybody.
That's a big task.
It is a big task. I'm sorry, and we only have a minute each to do it.
You know, I would say that there are a couple of things that I'd highlight here from the discussion. Number one, we have to be ambitious. We have to go big, but we have to do it with humility. We have to use some of the strengths that we have in the United States, like technology and data, but we have to do it with consideration for the decisions that people around the world will make in the way they need to make it. The last thing that I'd just say is we also somehow need to figure out how to build longer timescales into how we partner with people and think not just what this administration can do immediately, but how we allow the time we need to develop substantive, deep relationships and allow those to mature and to be able to build on those. And that goes beyond politics. I'll stop there.
Oh, that's great. And you've set the bar for being quick and precise and insightful. And maybe Cynthia.
Great, thanks, Tegan. Okay, last insights. One, as the administration rightly focuses on the relevance of climate change to national security, I beg of them to keep the development actors at the table and to remember that when we talk about security, we are not talking about only guns and bombs and borders. We are talking about all of the aspects of human security that we've discussed in detail here today. And you need your development agency and your diplomatic agency at the table for those conversations to make sure that as we talk about these issues domestically, those same perspectives are integrated, which connects directly to another of the administration's goals to focus on environmental justice in this conversation. Those dynamics are all connected. My second mention would be a focus on building resilient systems. As we've seen in Texas over the last week, you can't predict every threat to the system, whether it's directly from climate change or not. What there will be are an increasing number of stresses on all of our systems, domestically and overseas. And we need to focus on how you build more resilient systems that can withstand a variety of stresses and shocks while maintaining stability. And the last point I would make is peace building first. Peace building does not usually come as the first initiative or the most well-funded initiative. And yet what we know from the development space is that investing in peace building initiatives, in relationships, in building the connections between people to solve their problems is a great investment that stands you in good stead when shocks from things like droughts or floods hit those systems and hit those people. They will be much better able to withstand those things in a way that preserves stability and peace if you've done your first work investing in peace building. So I would argue for that domestically as well as internationally, and make sure that we have a kind of peace building first frame on some of these questions. Thanks.
Wow, thank you. Folks are also eloquent. Sherry, some concluding comments.
Okay, I think I'll just start where Cynthia left off, which is I say, yes, I think that environmental security 2.0 for the 21st century is one that leads on environmental peace building. And I would say that the human, let's talk about the people who are going to do the work, the human capital, the talent that's either still resident in agencies, in contractors, or coming in with the new administration, the next generation. That's what they want. The people I mentor and talk to all the time, whether they're in the military or outside, think tank scholars they want to work on these issues. This is what they want to do. They don't want to go back to the kinetic way of thinking about things. And so I think the time is ripe to build this new community of practice where climate and environmental security has environmental peace building concepts embedded into it. That is inclusive of development, disaster risk, diplomacy with defense in support, and that galvanizes the work coming out of the innovation sphere, as we've discussed before, to really make this a leading edge effort in the 21st century.
Thank you very much. And Chip, any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
If the Biden administration decides to go big and go bold like we're recommending, they need to do it with due regard for making sure they take care that that portion of the US population that feels they've been abandoned by the political leadership realize improved employment and improved education opportunities.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the last word to Aaron.
Well, I smartly ceded my time to Cynthia Tagan, Sherry, and Chip. They did a much better job than I'll do. Just very quickly, look, all of our work is happening in very fragile settings, in very low resource settings. Cynthia, many years ago, introduced me to this term of doing conflict sensitive programming. I think we need to do peace building forward programming. Cynthia said it. We need to embed principles of peace building in all the work that we do. We are foregoing opportunities every single day to embed ways of bringing communities together within our programming. Cynthia mentioned the Water for the World Act. Again, most of those activities are going to be happening in conflict-sensitive countries. We shouldn't just be measuring taps and toilets out of those activities, but we should be measuring process outcomes, where we've worked to build community structures, build institutional responses, build capacity to work together and to solve disputes. We need a better set of metrics and indicators for our programming going forward that will incentivize and ensure that peace building is integrated into the work that we do going forward.
I want to thank you. I want to thank the Environmental Peace Building Association, the Wilson Center, for co-sponsoring this event. I want to thank the audience for attending and raising all these important questions. And I want to say it has been a real honor to moderate this panel. Thank you all so much for your experience, your wisdom, your insight. I know that the Environmental Peace Building Association will be making this wisdom available in note form at a later date. Thank you very much, everybody. And that ends today's session.
Thank you, Richard. Very well done.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Thank you,
Great job.
Richard.
Thank you, Richard.
Everyone.
Bye, all.
Take care, everybody.